Democracy, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, there is a word that stirs up feelings and thoughts in one's mind. Democracy is what Winston Churchill once said was the worst form of government possible, except for all the other choices. And what do we mean by democracy? In the United States, we are not a democracy. We are a constitutional republic. Now, a republic comes out of a democracy, but the concept of a democracy by definition would mean that every single person has to go through and vote on every single issue. Now, we as a society today are fortunate when we get 50 to 60% of the people to actually turn up for a presidential election. We can't even get the entirety of the nation wound up about a presidential election, then we have no chance about, sanitation or, raw sewage disposal or things along those lines. But we are going to see a change coming now. Now, America has been a constitutional republic, as I said, since the beginning. However, those who have made the decisions as to who would go to Washington, for example, to represent us, has not always been universal. We are going to see during the age of Jackson a change. We are going to see more and more people start to get the ability, the right to actually vote and have a say in what was going on within their government. When we say it's a rise of a mass democracy, this doesn't mean that everyone is going to get to be voting and it's going to be a perfect world in which we all link arms and sing kumbaya. But we're going to be getting a lot better than we had been. America is a nation that is constantly moving forward. We are a nation which is constantly improving. Have we screwed up? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Have we made mistakes? Whoppers. But we are getting better with every step and with every turn. We get a little more along the lines of what the framers had really hoped we would be one day. More than once, I've told you that a true genius of the American people is our ability to compromise. I've said it before, we see ourselves as an uncompromising people, but we have a real genius for that. Now, the drawback is what to some may be a compromise, to others can look like some kind of shenanigans. And so in the election of 1824, we're going to end up seeing something that has come down through history to be known as the corrupt bargain. Now, while there is no proof of this, while it is not one of those things that we can point to, oh, here is the quote unquote smoking gun, here is the document proving whatever. We can't prove that, but it does have that feel that something wasn't quite right. Elections always have very strange turns, ladies and gentlemen, and the election in 1824 was far from the exception to this one. Now, we're talking about an election that's coming up at the end of what was known as the era of good feelings. We talked about that previously. Okay. Now, as the era of good feelings was coming to a close, when we had essentially had one party rule for quite a while, we now were going to see a change. We were going to start to see a polarization within the political spectrum of life, that you're going to start seeing what today we would recognize more as the Democratic Party, and you're going to see at this time another party coming of age called the Whigs. But in this case, we are going to see the way that politics were going to be transforming themselves, okay? And the big winner out of all of this was going to be the common man. Now, when I say that, specifically, it's more along the lines of every white man over the age of 21, I believe it was at the time. This is called universal white manhood suffrage. Basically, it's going to become the norm. It's going to become standard that if you are a guy, if you are white and you're over a certain age, 21, then you're going to have the right to vote. Now, this is what is set up on a national level. Each individual state does retain the right to go through and set up how they wanted things to be in their state for voting privileges. But it was going to be for white males that you would now have universal. The nation would recognize that as the minimum requirement. Now, like I said, some states would do things differently. Some states, for example, Wyoming, for example, they went through and they were allowing women to vote very early on in the 1860s. So it really was going to depend on each individual state. But under President Jackson, in this, what they refer to as the Jacksonian era, you're going to see a very large shift. You're going to be moving away from concepts like property requirements and things along those lines to a point where a vast proportion of the American population will now have the ability to go vote. Again, just like today, it doesn't necessarily mean that every single person who can vote is actually going to go do so, but at least we're going to be increasing the number of people who have that opportunity. Like I said previously, we are far from a perfect society, but we keep moving forward. Okay, we went from very restrictive, very limited number of people who could vote, and we have continuously expanded that throughout the centuries to the point that we are today. So under the Jacksonian era, as I said, though, this is going to be a major shift in that essentially we will have universal white manhood suffrage at that point. We would still keep moving forward. We would still keep adding various groups and whatnot until we arrived where we are today, where essentially it is if you are a U.S. citizen and over the age of 18, you have now met the qualifications to register to vote. But again, that was going to take some time. So what happened in 1824? This was an election year. It was a very tumultuous election year, to say the very least. You could argue that every single presidential election is of major consequence, and that is absolutely true. But there are different presidential elections which become what could be known as a watershed event, that this is going to cause various changes, not just at that immediate time, but further down the road. And the election of 1824 was one of those. Okay, one of the things that was different about an election at that point in time that we don't really think about today is the number of candidates. Now, granted, we only tend to think about the Republican and the Democratic candidate running for president at any point in time right now, even though there are literally, a dozen or more people running for president from a variety of different parties. 1824, though, it was much more common to see a multitude of candidates. And in this case, we're actually going to have four of them. We're going to have four, towering candidates at this point in time, some big names in American history. For example, one of the candidates from Tennessee was Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson, we'll talk more about him. He is a president that gives his name over to an entire era, or an entire age. So Andrew Jackson is going to have a major, major effect on American history, and he is one of the four during this time frame. Another individual at this point is Mr. Henry Clay of Kentucky. Now, Henry Clay is going to be a perennial also ran when it came to the presidency. Henry Clay is going to try numerous times to become president of the United States, but he's never going to attain his goal. He is going to go down probably more famously as having been the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And that in and of itself is, a major job within government. But if your goal is to be president, that's not quite getting to where you want to be. Third individual that's running at this time that you may have never heard of is Mr. William Crawford of Georgia. And you also are going to have the son of a former president. This is going to be the first time we see the child of a president running for president. We have Mr. John Quincy Adams. Now, John Quincy Adams, you might recall, was instrumental as Secretary of State running interference for the United States in the Treaty of Ghent during the War of 1812, and he's going to be running for president now. If you recall, his father was the only one of the presidents up till that point in time that was a one-term president. Every other president had been a two-term president, and there has always been sort of the thought, question, whatever phrase you would like to use as to whether or not John Quincy Adams was trying to exorcise the demons of his dad being only a one-term president. Now, here's the interesting thing. All four of these individuals refer to themselves as Republicans. Now, yes, it is capitalized Republican, but do not think in terms of the Republicans of today. Okay, the Republican Party that we know today didn't come into existence until the 1850s. But, at this point in time, this is sort of the offshoot, language-wise, of the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. So all four of these guys are essentially claiming to be Republicans, basically saying that they're all almost the same party and whatnot, and therefore each of them has some kind of claim on that particular title. 3 were referred to as being a favorite son of their respected region. Okay, you can think John Quincy Adams being from the New England area. You'd have Andrew Jackson out on the frontier. You'd have Mr. Crawford from the South. But Henry Clay thought of himself as the only one of the 3 who was a truly national figure. That Mr. Clay felt that since he had been the Speaker of the House of Representatives, since he had been the author of the American System that we talked about last chapter, that he was the only one that wasn't really a regional individual. And so as such, really think that he thought this gave him a leg up on the other candidates, that he would be able to draw on a more national base than any of the others would. As you already heard me mention before, however, Henry Clay is going to be the perennial also ran, and he is not going to be the winner in this particular election. But when we get to that concept of a corrupt bargain, that there was some kind of shenanigans going on, you're going to see how Henry Clay was, really a big name in regards to all of that. Now, in the results of this particular election, when all was said and done, when the votes were counted and everything, Andrew Jackson received the most popular votes, and he also received the most electoral votes. Now, in almost every single election, that has a tendency to mean that you won. But there is a problem with that concept. Under the Constitution, you have to win a flat-out majority in the Electoral College. Today, that's 270 votes. Now, today we generally only have 2 major political party candidates, so that's not really an issue. In this case, with there having been 4, it was possible to have majorities, but or a plurality rather. You would have at least one more vote than anybody else, but it did not mean you had that majority. And without a majority in the Electoral College, you cannot be president. So Andrew Jackson comes in first place in the popular vote and in the Electoral College. Okay, so the not the majority, but the largest number of people voted for Jackson. Second place was going to be John Adams. Okay, he comes in second in both the Electoral College and in the popular vote. Then you get Mr. Crawford. Now, Crawford is in a very interesting position. He comes in fourth in the popular vote. So of all the people who voted, he got the fewest votes. But he was actually third in the Electoral College. Then you've got Mr. Clay. He came in third in the popular vote and was fourth in the Electoral College. So you have these 4 candidates, each of which received some votes in the Electoral College, but not a single one of them received a sufficient number of votes in the Electoral College to be named president. So what do we do? Well, the good news is there is a constitutional solution to this problem. Okay? Under the 12th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, what happens in a situation like this? You take the top 3 in the Electoral College. Okay? The top 3 vote getters will then be voted on in the House of Representatives. What happens is each state gets 1 vote in the House, and they argue about it until such time as somebody gets a majority of the states in the House. That person will become president. But you'll notice it says the top 3. We already established that first place in the Electoral College was Jackson, second place was Adams, and third place was Crawford. Henry Clay was in fourth place, so he was not in the running to be considered by the House. But you might remember, I said previously, Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. So Henry Clay, who is not going to be considered, is going to be the guy in charge of the organization that's going to decide who the president is going to be. Now, today we would talk about something called the appearance of impropriety. Not necessarily that there was anything wrong, not that there were any shenanigans or problems or things like that, but it doesn't really look good. And that's sort of where we start to get the problem here. This is how it's going to be perceived by some as there were some shenanigans going on. There was some corruption happening, that not everything was on the up and up. But again, there is no proof of that. It is just a feeling that a number of people have. This is again one of those mini subjects which I leave up to you to decide for yourself whether or not you believe that there was a corrupt bargain or not. But now we've got everything in the House of Representatives. We have our top 3 vote getters. And so now we have to figure out how are we going to finish this little story. Now, Clay had been eliminated. You were only allowed to consider the top 3 vote getters in the Electoral College in this situation. But the problem is, if you want to throw one wrench into the works, Henry Clay is the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He is in charge of the organization that's going to decide who the next president is going to be, and the choices are people that he was running and actively working against. Now, let's add one more little problem here. One of the 3, Mr. Crawford of Georgia, has a stroke. He is paralyzed on one side of his body, so he's out of the running. It comes down to just John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. And to make matters worse, Clay hated Andrew Jackson. He could not stand the man. And so as a result, he threw his support behind John Quincy Adams. Now, we're not talking about like he used any kind of official means. He didn't use his quote-unquote authority or anything like that. But instead, he's going to use his influence. He's going to use the relationships, the friendships that he has built up over the years in Congress to convince different people from the various state delegations to vote for John Quincy Adams over Andrew Jackson. And the result of all of this is that John Quincy Adams is elected President of the United States. Now, you could look at this knowing that Clay did not like Jackson, and you would think that that's what most people would consider. They thought that it was just, rudeness or something along those lines. But it actually is going to look a little worse. Now, after George Washington was president, John Adams was elected because, he had been vice president. That was basically, his experience and stuff. But every president after that, starting with Thomas Jefferson, their job beforehand had been something like Secretary of State. Secretary of State was the traditional stepping stone to get to the presidency. And when John Quincy Adams becomes president, he can appoint whomever he wishes to the office of Secretary of State. It doesn't have to be approved by anyone except for the Senate. The Senate has to give their consent, and that's it. And to make matters worse, he appoints Henry Clay to be Secretary of State. Now, like I said, this is the traditional stepping stone to the presidency. Now, it doesn't matter that Henry Clay was immeasurably qualified for this job. He had, all the background necessary. He would do a good job at it and everything like that. But the problem is what today we would refer to as the appearance of impropriety. Not necessarily that anything wrong had been done, but it looked like something wrong had happened. And in fact, the Jacksonians, they cry foul play and corruption. They say that the people's choice had been thwarted, that his rightful victory to become president had been stolen by career politicians in Washington. And this is the kind of argument we're going to see a lot from this point right through the present day. This is not the only time where you're going to have someone win the popular vote but not become president. And it is still an issue today. It is a rare occurrence, but it does happen from time to time. The Jacksonians are going to be upset because the way they see it, the people had wanted Jackson, and then it was stolen away from him. And they were not going to go quietly. In fact, a member of Congress, a gentleman by the name of John Randolph, publicly went after this alliance between Adams and Clay. And it got so acrimonious, it got so bad, ladies and gentlemen, that it ended up in a duel between Randolph and Clay. Now, the good news was both men escaped unscathed. Neither man was hurt or anything like that, so that was a plus. But it does show that the passions were so inflamed over this issue that there were those willing to draw blood. There were those willing to give their lives or take a life because of this corrupt bargain. Now, the thing is, even though this was now nearly 200 years ago, there has never been any evidence come to light that proves any of this. A lot of people do believe that this was what happened, that it was basically Clay was bought off somehow, but there's no evidence of that. The big result of all this is that both men really caused some damage to their own reputations. Everybody involved came away a little stained as a result of this. It would cause Andrew Jackson to go through and nurture a deep-seated resentment against the powers that be in Washington. It would pretty much ensure that John Quincy Adams' presidency was going to be all but stillborn, that there was not a whole lot he was going to be able to accomplish. And that fact, plus the fact that Jackson was growing this anger, ensured that this was not going to be the last time that the American people heard the name Andrew Jackson.